The smartwatch in the 1872 photo shouldn't exist. My wrist bleeds where the shackle isn't. The apartment locks itself, the lights flicker like a dying heartbeat, and the smoke alarm screams. Except there's no fire. Sarah's voice cuts through the chaos, but the doors won't open. The wedding ring in the daguerreotype has my serial number. The past is rewriting me out of existence, and it's already started. Michael Davis sat in the dim light of his Boston study, the silence of the room punctuated only by the rhythmic clink, clink, clink of a brass skeleton key striking his wedding ring. The key was cold, a heavy anchor of Victorian metal that bit into his thumb, reminding him that he was solid, that he was present, that the year was 2024. He focused on the sensation of the ridges against his skin, a tactile defense against the blurring edges of his sanity. Before him lay a daguerreotype from 1872, a silver-plated ghost of a man standing in a dusty frontier street. Through the magnifying glass, the image was a grain of charcoal and shadow. But as Michael leaned closer, a cold sweat broke across his neck. On the outlaw's wrist, partially obscured by a rough wool sleeve, sat a sleek, rectangular silhouette that defied history. It was a modern smartwatch, the glass face catching a phantom glint of 19th century sun. Michael's breath hitched, the air in the room suddenly tasting of copper and old, sun-baked dirt. He checked his own wrist, where his identical watch glowed with a steady, blue pulse. Then came the sting. A sharp, searing heat erupted around his left wrist, beneath the watch band. He hissed, peeling back the silicone strap. The skin was raw, a deep, circular welt blooming into a bloody abrasion, as if an invisible iron shackle had been tightened until the flesh gave way. The blood was red, hot, and terrifyingly real. It dripped onto the desk, a modern stain on an ancient mystery, linking him to the man in the photo by more than just a resemblance. He had to know. He had to prove this was a digital forgery, a prank played by a bored archivist. Michael moved with a frantic, clinical efficiency, his jaw clenched tight enough to ache. He reached for his high-end flatbed scanner, the machine humming to life with a sterile mechanical whine. He placed the daguerreotype on the glass, his fingers trembling. As the scanning bar began its slow, luminous crawl across the image, the air in the apartment shifted. The scent of ozone, sharp and stinging like a coming thunderstorm, filled his nostrils. Suddenly, the lights flickered. His smart home hub, a sleek white cylinder on the bookshelf, pulsed a violent, angry crimson. "Security breach detected," the synthesized voice announced, though it sounded distorted, stretched like a cassette tape melting in the sun. The electronic locks on his front door engaged with a series of heavy, metallic thuds. Michael lunged for the door, but the handle refused to budge. The smart glass of his windows frosted over instantly, turning opaque and hard as steel. Smoke began to curl from the walls, smelling of scorched plastic and burning dust. The building's technology wasn't just malfunctioning, it was turning into a cage, a mechanical assassin designed to erase him before he could digitize the truth. "Michael, are you in there?" The voice was muffled, coming from the hallway. "Sarah." She was early with the historical records he'd requested. Michael coughed, the smoke thickening into a gray veil that stung his eyes. "Sarah, stay back. The system is blowing." He scrambled toward the kitchen, where the manual override panel was hidden behind a decorative cabinet. The floorboards beneath his feet felt strangely soft, almost like shifting sand. A spark erupted from the thermostat, a miniature lightning bolt that scorched the wallpaper. He reached the panel, but the plastic casing was hot to the touch, melting into a black sludge. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove and smashed the casing, bearing the cluster of wires beneath. His hands, usually steady enough for micro-soldering, were shaking. He ignored the heat, reaching into the sparks to find the master kill switch. The copper bit into his fingertips, a jolt of electricity racing up his arm, but he slammed the lever down. With a dying groan, the apartment went dark. The locks clicked open. Sarah tumbled inside, coughing, her arms wrapped around a thick leather portfolio. The lethal electronic trap had been neutralized, but the silence that followed was heavier than the noise. "You're bleeding," Sarah gasped, her eyes wide behind her oversized glasses. She dropped her bag and reached for his arm, but Michael pulled away, his thumb already finding the brass key in his pocket. Clink, clink, clink. "It's a localized anomaly," Michael whispered, his voice rasping. "Look at the photo, Sarah. Look at the wrist." They huddled over the desk, lit now only by the pale, dying glow of Michael's laptop battery. Sarah pulled a magnifying loupe from her pocket, her ink-stained fingers steady. She studied the outlaw, the man the archives called Silas Thorne. Her breath caught. "It's not just the watch, Michael. Look at the hand." She pointed to the outlaw's ring finger. Even in the grainy silver print, a wedding band was visible. It was a unique design, a braided pattern of platinum and gold. "I commissioned that ring 3 days ago," Michael said, his voice a flat, dead thing. "It's one of a kind." Sarah leaned in closer, her nose almost touching the paper. "There's an engraving on the inside edge. I can see the start of a serial number." She looked up at him, her face pale. "It's your biometric ID number, Michael. The one encrypted into your legal jewelry. This isn't a replica. This is your ring. In 1872. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The man in the past wasn't an ancestor who looked like him. The man in the past was him. The past wasn't just a memory. It was a predator, and it had finally caught his scent. The room began to tilt. Michael gripped the edge of the oak desk, but the wood felt different. Rougher, splintered, smelling of damp earth and lye. He closed his eyes, a violent seizure racking his frame. When he opened them, the Boston skyline outside his window was gone. The sleek, gray walls of his apartment were flickering like a failing film strip, replaced by heavy, sweating slabs of gray granite. His ergonomic chair vanished, leaving him slumped on a 3-legged wooden stool that groaned under his weight. "Michael." Sarah's voice sounded miles away, thin and tinny. He looked down at his legs. His designer jeans were fading, the denim becoming translucent, revealing the mossy stone floor beneath. He was losing his density, his molecular structure unraveling as the 1873 reality fought to overwrite his existence. The air was freezing now, thick with the stench of a dungeon. "I'm fading," he choked out. He scrambled for his medical kit, his fingers passing through the plastic casing twice before he could get a grip. He found a preloaded adrenaline pen. With a guttural cry, he slammed the needle into his thigh. The rush was instantaneous, a searing bolt of fire that forced his heart to hammer against his ribs. The chemical jolt acted as a temporary anchor, the surge of biological energy forcing his molecules to solidify. The stone walls receded slightly, the modern drywall of his study bleeding back into view. He was back for now, but his pulse was a frantic, terrified rhythm. He turned toward his computer, desperate to record what was happening. But the screen was a mess of shifting symbols. The digital text, his forensic notes, his lines of code, was literally melting. The pixels dithered and reformed, turning into elegant, looping cursive written in iron gall ink. The sleek monitor frame warped, the plastic turning into heavy, dark oak. His workstation was becoming a 19th century ledger desk. He watched in horror as his life's work was rewritten into a list of crimes. Horse theft, bank robbery, murder. Asterisk, and the history of Silas Thorne was erasing the life of Michael Davis. One bite at a time. Then, the sound started. A low, vibrating hum that made the marrow of his bones ache. It was a funeral dirge, slow and rhythmic, echoing from the hallway. A shadow stretched across the floor, not the shadow of a man, but something denser. A void in the shape of a tall figure in a heavy, moth-eaten greatcoat. The executioner. It stepped into the room, its face hidden beneath the wide brim of a black hat. In its gloved hands, it coiled a heavy iron chain, the links clinking with a sound like falling teeth. It didn't speak. It simply moved, a slow, predatory advance. The chain whipped out, the cold metal biting into Michael's shoulder. The pain was blinding, a frost burn that turned his skin white. The entity was trying to bind him, to tether his soul to the dungeon floor so the timeline could finish its harvest. Michael lunged for the only weapon he had left, a high-voltage taser he kept for security. He thumbed the safety, the device crackling with blue light. "Get back," he screamed. As the executioner swung the chain again, Michael thrust the taser into the metal links. Michael's logic was sound. The taser delivered 50,000 volts, enough to drop a bull. He expected the spectral energy of the ghost to dissipate, to shatter under the concentrated electrical assault. In his mind, he saw the executioner flickering out like a blown bulb, giving him and Sarah time to run. This was his smart move, the application of modern physics against a primitive haunting. As the prongs hit the chain, a blinding blue arc erupted. The executioner didn't scream. It inhaled. The electrical current didn't disrupt the spirit. It fed it. The blue light raced up the chain and into the executioner's form, illuminating the moth-eaten coat from within. The entity grew taller, its presence becoming suddenly, terrifyingly physical. The floorboards beneath it groaned under newfound weight. Then came the blowout. The surge was too much for the apartment's weakened wiring. A massive explosion of sparks erupted from every outlet, a deafening crack that threw Michael across the room. The lights died instantly. The smart hub shattered. The smell of ozone was replaced by the thick, suffocating stench of an electrical fire. Michael hit the wall, the air driven from his lungs. His vision was a fractured mess of white spots and darkness. "Sarah," he croaked, but his ears were ringing so loudly he couldn't hear his own voice. He reached out, his hand brushing something cold and heavy. The executioner's chain. It wasn't a shadow anymore. It was solid, rusted iron, and it was wrapped around his ankle. The explosion hadn't repelled the ghost. It had provided the raw energy the entity needed to fully manifest in his reality. He was blind, trapped in the dark, and the hangman now had a physical grip on his life. "Michael, I'm here." Sarah's hand found his shoulder, her touch a desperate warmth in the freezing dark. She was pulling at the chain, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "I found it. The records. My grandfather." They scrambled toward the kitchen, the only place where the moonlight managed to pierce the opaque windows. Sarah shoved a yellowed, crumbling journal into his hands. Her voice was a frantic whisper. "My grandfather didn't just go missing, Michael. He was being hunted by the same thing. He spent years tracking these pulses in time. He called them the erasure. She looked at him, her glasses cracked, a smear of soot across her forehead. He realized the universe isn't a machine, it's an organism. When a timeline fractures, when a version of a person ends up where they don't belong, the universe treats it like a virus. It sends a white blood cell to clean it up. That's what the executioner is. It's the timeline's immune system. And it's not going to stop until one of you is dead. Silas or you. It doesn't care which, as long as the debt is paid. Michael gripped the journal, the paper feeling like dry skin. The weight of the revelation was a physical pressure on his chest. He wasn't a victim of a ghost. He was a glitch being deleted. The air grew colder, and Michael began to cough. It wasn't a dry cough. His lungs felt heavy, filled with a thick, phantom fluid. He doubled over, spitting clear liquid onto the floor. The sweating sickness. He wheezed. That's how Silas was supposed to die in the cell. The transition was accelerating. Outside the window, the moon was rising, a pale, sickly orb that matched the exact lunar phase in the 1872 daguerreotype. The deadline was tonight. The moment of the original execution was approaching, and the universe was tired of waiting. "We can anchor you," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "The smartwatch. It's still connected to the local network, right? If we can tether your GPS coordinates to the building's foundation, maybe we can hold your physical form here." Michael nodded, his fingers fumbling with the watch's touch screen. The glass was cracked, the numbers blurring, but he managed to initiate a high-frequency ping. I'm locking the signal," he gasped. But as the watch emitted a low, electronic hum, the floor beneath them began to ripple. The modern hardwood didn't just break. It turned to liquid, a dark, swirling vortex of mud and shadow. Michael screamed as he sank, his legs disappearing into a half-phased reality. He was suspended between worlds, his torso in a 2024 apartment, his lower half dangling into the cold, damp cellar of a 1873 jailhouse. Subverted. Through the floorboards, Michael saw them. A mob of men in heavy wool coats and wide-brimmed hats, their faces twisted in the flickering light of torches. They weren't ghosts. They were the townspeople of Blackwood, 1873, and they were staring up at the demon appearing in their ceiling. "Witchcraft!" one of them roared, a man with a jagged scar across his cheek. Captain Walker. Michael reached for a heavy iron wrench that had fallen from his toolkit. He swung it with all his might, striking the first man who tried to grab his legs. The impact was solid. He felt the bones shatter beneath the iron. He felt a surge of triumph. He was fighting back. He was defending his life. If he could hold them off, Sarah could pull him up. But as the wrench struck the man, a searing pain shot through Michael's entire body. The man didn't fall. Instead, the color of the man's coat bled into Michael's skin. Every blow Michael landed didn't drive the mob away. It created a bridge. By physically interacting with the past, Michael was validating his presence there. He was plugging in to the 1873 circuit. With every strike, his modern clothes grew more tattered, transforming into the rough linen of a prisoner. The more he fought to stay in the present, the more he anchored himself to the past. The wrench in his hand turned into a rusted shackle. He realized too late that the mob wasn't the threat. His own resistance was the trap. By trying to beat the past into submission, he had woven himself into its fabric. The floor gave way entirely. With a final, echoing scream, Michael fell through the hole in time. leaving Sarah clutching nothing but a handful of empty air and a fading blue watch glow. The world was a roar of wind and ice. When the motion stopped, Michael was slammed onto a floor of cold, packed dirt. The smell was the first thing to return: manure, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. He looked up. The gray stone walls of the Blackwood County Jail were no longer flickering. They were solid. They were his reality. "Stand up, Thorne," a voice growled. Michael looked up into the face of Captain Walker. The man's waxed mustache twitched with disgust. He reached down, grabbing Michael by the collar and hauling him to his feet. Michael's hands were bound in heavy iron, the metal biting into his wrists where the phantom wounds had been only hours before. "Sarah," Michael whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He looked around the cell. In the corner, a shimmering, translucent figure stood. It was Sarah, but she looked like a reflection in a dirty window. She was reaching for him, her mouth moving, but no sound came through. She was the ghost now. Sarah's image flickered, her expression one of pure agony. She held up her grandfather's journal, pointing to a page scrawled in red ink. Equivalent exchange. The truth hit Michael with the force of a gallows drop. The universe didn't just want a body. It wanted a soul to fill the hole Silas Thorne had left. If Michael stayed here, he would die on the gallows, and the timeline would be satisfied. But if he tried to escape back to the present, the vortex would need a substitute. It would take the only other person tethered to the event. It would take Sarah. Michael looked at her, at the woman who had spent her life apologizing for existing, who was now being erased because of his logic, his mistakes. He saw the edges of her form beginning to fray into white light. "I won't let it take you," Michael mouthed. He turned away from the ghost and looked at the heavy stone wall of the cell. He reached into his pocket. His fingers found the brass skeleton key. It had traveled with him, the only thing from his world that felt right in this one. He began to scrape the metal against the soft limestone of the foundation, his movements rhythmic and desperate. Clink, clink, clink. The morning of the execution arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. The rain was a cold, steady needle prick against Michael's skin as they led him out to the square. The gallows stood in the center of the mud-slicked plaza, a towering skeleton of raw pine that smelled of sap and death. Captain Walker stood on the platform, straightening his cravat 3 times with a crisp, military snap. The crowd was a sea of gray and brown, their eyes hard and hungry. They wanted a show. They wanted the demon to swing. Michael felt the rough hemp of the noose settle around his neck. The fibers were oily, smelling of salt. He looked at the executioner, who stood by the lever, not a ghost now, but a man in a black hood, a physical manifestation of the end. But Michael wasn't defeated. In his hand, hidden by the long sleeves of his prison shirt, he clutched the lithium battery he had ripped from his smartwatch during the night. He had spent hours fraying the copper wiring of his wedding ring, creating a crude, high-energy circuit. As Walker began to read the death warrant, Michael looked toward a stack of wooden barrels sitting beneath the platform. They were marked with a red X, black powder for the midday salute. "Any last words, Thorne?" Walker sneered. Michael didn't look at him. He looked at the shimmering space in the air where he knew Sarah was watching from a century away. He pressed the copper wire to the battery terminals. A brilliant, white-hot spark erupted in his palm, searing his flesh. He dropped the short-circuiting battery into the open top of the nearest powder barrel. The world turned white. The explosion was a physical wall of sound that shattered the gallows. The trapdoor vanished beneath Michael's feet, but the noose snapped as the support beam was obliterated. He fell into a cloud of thick, acrid smoke that tasted of sulfur and grit. He didn't run for the hills. He crawled through the chaos, back toward the ruins of the jailhouse. He found the stone he had marked during the night, the hidden foundation block beneath the main gate. With the last of his strength, he used the brass key to finish the message. Michael Davis. Serial number 8829-X. I am here. I am real. Live, Sarah. He felt the vortex pull at him one last time. A final, desperate attempt by the universe to drag him back into the void. But the debt was paid. The explosion had killed the outlaw Silas Thorne in the eyes of history. The record would show he died in the blast. The hole was plugged. Michael stayed in the shadows as the town burned and rebuilt. He lived in the woods, then in a small cabin by the river. He became a man of the earth, his analytical mind turning toward the stars and the seasons. He never returned to 2024, but he never truly left it either. 150 years later, Sarah Johnson stood in the basement of the Blackwood Historical Museum. The air was cool, smelling of old paper and floor wax. She held a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dark. She reached the corner of the foundation, where the original stones of the jail remained. There, carved deep into the rock, were the words. The letters were weathered, filled with the dust of a century, but the serial number was unmistakable. Her fingers traced the lines, and for a moment, she felt a warmth in the stone, a rhythmic vibration like a heart beating. She turned to the final display in the archive, a photograph found in a local estate sale. It was an old man, sitting on a porch in the late 1890s. He had white hair and tired eyes, but he was smiling. On his finger was a hand-forged ring, and in his hand he held a heavy brass skeleton key. Sarah didn't apologize. She didn't reach for her phone to log a regret. She simply leaned against the stone, closed her eyes, and listened to the silence of a timeline that was finally, peacefully whole.